going to start, and today I will be double role, moderating and be the first speaker. This because this series, which is in collaboration with the Open Society, was born out of an article that I have written about, this is the title of the article, Wielding the Purse String of Southeast Asian Civil Society, and will be a series of 4 events, and today is the first one. But first let me introduce SEA Junction for those who are not familiar. This is a public venue, a small venue focusing on Southeast Asia. Normally you can come and read about Southeast Asia, we have various resources, or just meet other people who are interested in the issue. But we also have different kinds of events, including today about funding of civil society, a few days ago about migration in Thailand, before about lesbians in Laos, a movie screening. So as you can see, the topics are very varied on all the dimensions of Southeast Asia. My name is Silvia Shortino, and I am the founder of SEA Junction, and today also the first speaker. So I will start, and then I will introduce the other 2 speakers, who are, or maybe I introduce them now. Midnight, Liz, will be the second, and he is the director of APCOM, an organization that works with LGBTs, particularly gay people, and then Nana Chandrakirana from Indonesia, who will be an activist, woman activist, as well as human rights and many more arts. So she will talk about the challenge again for Indonesia particularly, but then also linking to more generally Asia, because she's active also in many regional organizations. So I will start with this topic, just giving an overview of the issue. So first we need to understand the context, and the context at this moment in time is that democracy in Southeast Asia, or more generally in the entire world, is experiencing a decline. I don't think I need to elaborate on this, being in Thailand. I think we are all aware of the current situation, but it's the same in most of the countries in Southeast Asia. Civil society is affected, since, as we know, the political context, more authoritarian context, is not very sympathetic to civil society. And this also affects, and is affected by the availability of resources. Now, there is a lot of discussion about shrinking space for civil society, but rarely we pay attention to the funding. But how can we expect to have a vibrant civil society if we also don't provide the resources, human and financial resources? Now, the government, of course, especially these days, in Southeast Asia, have never been really in love with civil society, but particularly these days are even less. But it's not only the internal factor, it's also the external factor. It's also shifting in the development landscape. The donor agencies are repositioning themselves in line with more conservative context in their own country as well as abroad. A new set of donors is coming up in Southeast Asia, but they are so far not that interested in civil society for democracy or more advocacy group. I will discuss here briefly 4 factors, and I refer to the article as well as our discussion later on to elaborate on this. The 4th factor that I will be discussing is first, greater control by government of funding streams. Second, as I say, the reshaping of international aid spending, in particular international aid. Third, paradigmatic shift in the philanthropic sector. Now, philanthropic sector, we mean here particularly foundation, private foundation, but later on we will elaborate about foundation in Asia that are somewhat different from the traditional US foundation or European foundation. And 4th one, a scarce appreciation of civil society among indigenous donors, and this can be individual, rich individual. We know that in Southeast Asia nowadays there is a pool of rich people who also have a foundation or family foundation, but they are not particularly interested in funding, in particularly advocacy activity, NGO. So let's start with the first one. As I said before, governments in Southeast Asia normally are quite suspicious of civil society organizations, and particularly when those organizations have missions that challenge the status quo. It's somewhat different for organizations that provide services like health services, educational services. They can still be seen as partner. But when it comes more to watchdog or NGO working on human rights issues, that is much more sensitive. Only in the last decades, actually, we have seen a more sympathetic attitude towards this civil society organization, but mostly because donors have somewhat pressured government to work together with non-governmental bodies. Now this government have become somewhat more sophisticated. I think in the past they may have just closed NGO that they didn't like, but now they know that this is not a very good, so to say, public relations stance. So they prefer to have different kind of measure, and often this measure is more in the regulatory framework. So ASEA in general, this is a recent report from the Philanthropy about philanthropic freedom, and it shows that the tax policies, the registering, operating of civil society, the transferring of money across border for this region is quite problematic. So in this region, there are many regulations that actually impede or are barriers to the establishing of organization. You can think about Vietnam or Laos, but also in many countries like Singapore, for instance, it's easier to start a business rather than register a non-profit organization. Now, the measures that government employ to restrict the operation of civil society are many. The most traditional, which since the past has been said that civil society are just foreign agents, they are willing to, and here, forgive the words, prostitute themselves, do whatever the donor asks them to do to promote a Western agenda. So vilified, criminalized, if necessary, they can also be brought to court or to jail. Withholding of public funds, they don't receive funds if they don't behave according to the wish of the government, limiting the type of activities that NGO can carry out. So, okay, service provision may be okay, but when it comes to other kind of activity, this organization are not allowed to do that. Taxing donation, of course, if you're an organization is in the position to receive donation, but then the government will put an heavy tax on that, maybe the donor will rethink about giving money to a non-governmental organization. Requiring donor to register more and more, this is also in Thailand, for instance, donors that were before with the Foreign Affairs Ministry, which was somewhat more liberal with more rights. Now they are being moved to the Ministry of Labor, and there they have more regulation that prevent to hire staff or to operate in the country. Now this is also happening in many other countries in the region. And applying anti-terrorist measures. Now we know that after September 11, there were all kinds of new rules introduced for the banks. They have to declare what kind of funding are being received and not, but there is also a lot of misuse of these rules to control civil society group. Now we can see, if you think about 20 years, in the last 20 years, now more and more these fiscal measures are being used. So regulatory and fiscal measures rather than the more blunt action against civil society. So that was the first factor, and again we can elaborate more. The second one has to do with the international development aid scenario itself. Now, the peak of international aid, many studies confirm, was around 2001. This was when there was more generosity on the country of the so-called OECD countries, so the rich country of the world, in terms of giving to third parties. Nowadays, it's going down. Everywhere in the world is being cut, but in particular, aid to Southeast Asia has gone down quite significantly because Southeast Asia is not a priority for most donors. So they would prefer to give to Africa, to India, to China, other places, but Southeast Asia as a region for various reasons. One is geopolitical relevance, trade relevance, but also in terms maybe seen as a region that don't need any more international aid because it has high economic growth without looking at the other problem. All these factors have somewhat made of Southeast Asia an area that is not a priority on most of the international donor. We also see that, let's say, Australia or England or Canada even, they have tied international aid to trade and foreign affairs. Now, we knew that international aid somewhat has always been related to foreign affair priority of the country, but now it's very clear. Let's say Australia, house aid is no longer existing, doesn't exist a body fully dedicated to international aid. Has become part of the foreign affairs and trade department, and this has been happening in most of the country, which means the priority of international development have also changed. We also see more and more a closeness of the business sector with the international development sector, and donors moving away from civil society. If before they would invest in a vibrant civil society, now the word is we want a vibrant business community. We want social entrepreneur. We want business that behave according to better rule. But there is less and less attention for a civil society. Even the kind of solutions that are provided for problems in our countries are mostly economic solutions. Again, impact investment, or we can talk more about this new trend of investing not only in companies that have profit, but also that do good to society. And many other ways. Public-private partnership is another model of development. So there is more and more working close together of commercial enterprise with government, also in terms of international aid. Not to talk about many consultancy companies like McKinsey and others that nowadays are a strong voice in the international community. There is also an unprecedented use of commercial contractors to give aid. Now, in the past, if you are old enough to remember, you would give the money to international NGO, and then the international NGO would distribute to the local NGOs. Now, they give money to contractors. And these contractors are not many people know about all these contractors like Co-Water, for instance, Canadian contractor or others, that are simply business oriented, and they are there to disburse the funds, doing the due diligence for the donor. And there is not much public scrutiny about them, even if they are very big sometimes. They can have the capacity to disburse billions of dollars. In the name of effectiveness of aid, there has been a lot of streamlining of programs, concentration of money in the center, so to say, and the line down to the local NGO has become longer and longer. This was initially international aid in the 60s. Then there was a period in which the philosophy was to give directly to small organizations. Small is beautiful, and you had to reach the local organization because they were more effective. But now we are going back to a world that is more multi-layered, and there are more and more subcontractors in the game. Now, what is the implication for civil society? They become implementers, yeah? So the program have already been designed, then there are contractors that execute them, and then the one who will receive at the end, they are there to perform what has already been decided. They are no more independent actors that would think with their own head about what our country needs and what we can do. They have to carry out programs that have already been designed. The new donors, and here China, of course, come immediately to mind, but actually there are many other interesting donors that we don't know much about, including, for instance, Emirates or people from Saudi Arabia and other Muslim countries, for instance, from the Middle East that are quite rich. And they also give donors, but they are not really interested in civil society. We can discuss this more into the discussion part. Now, the third factor is philanthropy. And now philanthropy has actually been the main donor, especially US philanthropy, US foundation like the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, Open Society is still active, and many others of this, as well as European foundation like the Erich Ball Foundation, for instance. They have been those who have provided direct funding to civil society. They often had their field office in the country, so they knew they could talk the language, the staff, so they knew who was the actor, and they would provide funding directly to organizations. But now, most of these foundations have also gone towards this commercialization of aid. What is called philanthrocapitalism, or I believe more in social enterprise, public-private partnership, and this kind of. This also because of the growth of the so-called technocratic or venture philanthropy. We believe in magic bullets. You find a solution and you apply everywhere in the world. No longer you talk about local ownership of local problems, no capacity building money. Organization needs to be already capable to carry out. And most of the time, these organizations are not in the country, in their view, also because they don't have field office. So, and because they are looking for the perfect solution. So you just choose the best person, the best organization, you give money to them, and they ideally find a solution that can be applied all over the world. No discussion about democratization of philanthropy. Now, the fourth and last one, the local. There has been a lot of hope that an alternative to the foreign philanthropy would be people that are in the country. So there has been a lot of effort also on the part of the foreign donor to start the so-called indigenous philanthropy, or at least to promote. And actually there is quite a lot of philanthropy going on. There are many family foundations, there are corporate foundations. They may not be registered as such, but they are active, but only few individuals would feel committed to the more advocacy kind of activity or human rights activity or human rights, often because indeed the dominant type are family foundation related to business corporation, local business, and of course they don't want to take too many risk in choosing topic, and often public relation or having a good image. So children, for instance, may be a very good topic for a lot of corporate philanthropy, but not necessarily abortion, just to call a safe abortion, or some other topics that are more sensitive. There is not much public relation in that kind of. So again, also for them, they are more interested in a private sector as a model, again, social enterprise. And so NGOs don't, at the moment, except for few individuals, that these are the exception. At the moment, indigenous philanthropy has not really proven an alternative, nor as religious philanthropy. Now, religious philanthropy or charity here, sometimes the definition is blurred, but there is a lot of talk about Islamic philanthropy. In Indonesia is major, yeah? I think Nana can talk maybe more about this, but there is a professionalized Muslim philanthropy. They give grants and they operate. One concern is again that they are also not necessarily transformative. They privilege their own religion, Buddhist, Islam, Christian. Not necessarily. There are again exceptions, but in general, the work they do is more relief and relief of immediate needs, not necessarily the long-term structural work that we would expect, and not necessarily the most political-oriented work. Again, there are always exceptions, and we should keep this in mind. But the dominant practice is not really supported. Now, in conclusion, unfortunately, if we look from the point of view, or at least from my analysis of working in this field for quite some time, I think at the moment we are in a moment of crisis, in a sense. Many civil society groups are complaining that they don't receive enough funding, or that they cannot determine the kind of program that they would like to do. The science, as one commentator said it, the science of delivery has been strangling the art of social transformation. Meaning, again, NGOs have been made into implementers. They can carry out programs as designed by the government or by main donors, but they are no longer given the freedom to think their own solution and to contribute to long-term social transformation. So there is a reduced place for human rights advocacy, for human rights defense, at the moment when the region needs most. Now, if we look at the problem of Southeast Asia these days, authoritarianism, of course, we have said that, but also identity politics, climate change, many of the issue, migration, all these topics are topics that require a strong civil, LGBT rights and many other. All this requires a strong civil society. But where are the funders and the supporters of civil society? This is the question that we hope to examine more in the next 4, and for sure this is a good start, I think, to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Good evening, my name is Midnight. Thank you so much, Leah and SEA Junction, for inviting me to be part of this panel discussion. We are very much in line with a lot of the discussions around civil society. So I work for an organization, an NGO network called APCOM, so we're based in Bangkok. We work on in 38 countries in the region, in Asia Pacific, on issues around HIV and also the advance and the rights of LGBTI people in the region. So as primarily an advocacy network, we receive funding mainly from international government. So no one from this region actually gives us kind of like funding to do our work. The reason why the advocacy is really important in this region. So we work on 3 kind of like strategic results. So one is around HIV is not over, particularly for young gay men in our region. Secondly, is around the protection and promotion of LGBTI rights in the region. 17 countries still have kind of laws against same-sex behaviors. And then lastly, it's about expanding the partnership to other sectors outside the NGO to ensure that our issues is not just in the NGO sector itself. It needs to kind of be broad-based to other civil society groups and also other sectors for them to understand and advocate on our behalf as well. In terms of our own experiences, we started in 2007 when I think at that time funding, particularly from Europe to civil society groups in this region, was much more unrestricted, meaning that civil society were able to determine what they would like to use that funding for and how they would want to use that for. And the donors didn't have that kind of a yearly kind of report how the funding is used and has it made an impact, because it was really about how to grow civil society movement in the region where there's not a lot of movement before. So those were the kind of thinking of ensuring that there is sustainable funding for civil society to grow and also to thrive. And as a regional organization, it's also important that issues at country level that are not able to be discussed can also be discussed when it's kind of like very much more political or politicized, or not able to kind of like get countries to move forward if it's not being discussed at the regional level first. Move ahead then, 10 years to now, we are struggling with donors that we thought could help support us because of the restrictions that Leah has just mentioned, particularly around the fact that donors are looking at, I guess, ways to not fund civil society groups in regions or countries where they say, oh, you are now developed into middle-income countries, so the government should then, your local government, domestic government, should have responsibility to then provide the support that we've been providing before. And as civil society organizations, you'll say, oh, but the funding that we receive and not from the local, domestic government are two things that governments don't provide funding for. So in our case, it's about working on kind of like rights-based issues and also talking about prevention for HIV. When I think a lot of people think there's a lot of money that goes to HIV, but in fact, for civil society organizations, it's not very much at all. Not to the point that they become sustainable, that they can also do their work without funding internationally. So that's the kind of like the reality that we're in at the moment. So what are solutions? We have to kind of look for additional sources of funding, but in terms of the work that we've been doing, that's not the kind of work that civil society do. We're not fundraisers. We're not working in bureaucracy where we have to kind of like do reports all the time, or making sure that our account is all in order. It's about it's taken our focus away from the actual work that civil society is supposed to be doing, particularly around raising issues, capacity building for our own communities to be able to raise their own issues as well at country level. And I think most important is about being able to do the watchdog in different spaces, not just say at the local level, but how do we then take that up to the regional level and advocate that at global level as well. So the shrinking space, it's happening, and I think civil societies are finding it difficult to continue the way that they've been able to work previously. So now I also get people asking, well, but then, we can't expect handouts all the time. What is civil society doing to ensure that they are able to either be sustainable, or secondly, but you've been doing the work without having funding before, so how have you operated? So I think those are kind of things I get asked all the time. And I would say, well, how do you expect civil society to be strong and strengthened when they're not even be able to kind of get regular income? They've got enough to kind of worry about already. And why should their work be seen only as volunteering only? When, say, we deal with people working in sectors that we know they get a lot of funding, they get a lot of money to administer the grants that they give to civil society, for example. So I think those are the things that we need to kind of think about how then we turn that around and say, well, Leah has that big picture about the air going in and then the water coming out very little. And that's going to be even more layered, because there's not many civil society organizations that can directly receive funding from donors. So if there is a mechanism, I think, within our region that can unlock that, that can be the kind of fiscal host to be able to do that for the region, and that is trusted by donors and other agencies, because the rules and regulations that is required to do that, it's a lot. And I think civil societies don't want to be that, you become administrator as well, you can be seen to be administrator. I guess it's not all doom and gloom. I think some countries as well try to unlock the way that domestic governments are funding civil society groups. We've been part of this Global Fund project, Regional Global Fund project, together in partnership with the Australian Federation of this organization, working in 4 countries that are transitioning out of Global Fund eligibility, so meaning that they are seen as being rich or rich enough that they can so unlock the domestic financing to civil society groups. And I think governments can say, oh look, we have bits of money here, there, at the local level, governmental level, but civil societies are not coming to access that funding. And then civil societies say, oh, but it's so difficult to access that funding because it's just for service delivery. So for health, for example, for HIV, you can access that funding if you only do, say, condoms and lube distributions, if you only do needle syringe distributions. But it's not about the capacity building for civil society groups themselves to be watchdogging, for example, to do advocacy around, oh, actually the services that we provide for, to do the service, say, condoms, lubricants, only in this area is not actually the most effective. We should be doing something else online, for example. So they cannot actively change the way that the program is being run, or trusting the civil society enough to kind of like develop a program themselves. So that's another kind of issue. The main one is actually about being able to contract with the government sector in a much more longer-term, sustainable way. And people say, like, in Thailand and also in Malaysia, where there's a lot of big health funding, and there should be enough for civil society if they can access that funding. But the reality is it's really difficult for civil society to be part of the discussions around allocation of budgets and how that should be, how the mechanism should be changed so then civil society groups can access that funding. So to give an example, if you're not registered, then you cannot get the funding, right? So Lee has also mentioned about restrictions on registration, on certain things that you can do and you can't do. So many civil societies don't want to access that. Or if they access the funding from government, then it could be seen as not being able to then criticize, or else they will lose the funding. What we know that from China, when they transitioned out of Global Fund, we saw so many civil society groups kind of like really collapsed, and the only way that they can like sustain is to register as kind of like a company, social enterprises, to do that, and there isn't enough time for civil society to realign themselves to think of additional funding outside. I think it takes time, as you know, to kind of get any different forms or formats or donors to come on board. At APCOM, we started engagement with the private sector about 2 years ago when we celebrated our 10th anniversary. So we come up with this idea of doing celebrations of HIV and LGBTI heroes in the region, and then give awards to the heroes that don't get recognized. So we use that as a way to engage them. And being based in Bangkok, we think it should be quite easy to kind of engage with private sector, particularly around issues that is very sexy at the moment. You see LGBTI rights movement globally, right? But in actual fact, when you actually talk to the private sector, they still find it unusual to work with civil society because they're like, why do we want to brand, lend our brand to you? What would you get out of from branding with civil society organization, and how would that look for their own brand as well? So it's really much a conversation, and it will take a lot of time to kind of get that through. So last year when we did the Hero was the second time, and this time it was done at the British Embassy, so in partnership with the the British Embassy, we got a bit more people who want to partner with us because it was the embassy that was supportive. So I think we have to think of a way to then engage with supportive partners or the one who's got like a brand that the private sector wants to partner with as well. So we can't just go directly to the private sector. We have to think maybe horizontally to think, okay, what would make the particular company support our work. And one of the things that we're thinking of doing is actually using there's global companies that are LGBT friendly, and they have subsidiaries in Bangkok and around the region. So how do we then unlock or link them together to make sure that whatever policies that they have at the global level actually gets translated to then their partner here in Bangkok, and then using that as a way to kind of engage them and hoping that their global partner will help support the local one to then engage with us and ensure that the policies and hopefully funding or technical expertise can then be lent to civil society groups in the region as well. For me, so right now, APCOM is going through a restructure because we know that this is going to be a difficult time, and if we don't change now in the way that we work, it will be much more difficult. So as I said, we rely a lot on project funding. So when project ends, then we have to say goodbye to staff, which is not sustainable in any way. But I think for me, as well as someone who's heading an organization like this, it's not nice to actually see someone that you kind of like work with and growing with the organization and say, I'm sorry, we're not able to kind of like support you, you have to look for another job, knowing that there's not a lot of opportunities as well, particularly working in like HIV and LGBTI in our region. So we are losing, I guess, an activist in a way because they're not able to kind of perform and have to do something else that they might not feel comfortable in, or knowing that they might have either their sexuality, their HIV status, or go to a different sector that it's only just for just to live rather than be passionate about. So I think we don't want to be losing that, particularly in the sector that's shrinking. We want more people to be part of this movement, more voices, and to ensure that and if we don't have a movement around this, I think it's quite easy to kind of, let's say, government won't take us seriously, and also that the donors at global level will see, well, it's not an issue because no one is making a fuss about it. So it's important to have these kind of discussions, but I think it's more important that there's action also afterwards to ensure that this is not going away. So thank you for joining tonight.
Everyone. Let me just introduce myself a little bit. I spent the past 20 years basically as an activist. That's my day job. But in the past 10 years, I've kind of started getting into the area of funding for movements. So I'm an activist, I build movements. I was a chair of the National Commission on Violence Against Women in Indonesia, where we worked at the national level with building coalitions around the country on women's human rights. And set up basically quite a unique mechanism for women's human rights. And then I was working at the UN Human Rights Council in their special procedures, so on discrimination against women. But in that process of working as an activist on the ground, it was very clear to me as I became more and more frustrated with the structure of how funding of our initiatives, our activism. I I decided at one point that I would kind of take the bull by the horns and try to really work on this through what I guess we could call activist funds. So these are grant-making organizations set up by activists for activism. One of them is the organization that's mentioned here, Indonesia for Humanity, which is a fund created by activists almost 25 years ago under the New Order regime that was supporting grassroots pro-democracy movements, supporting ex-political prisoners, mostly getting funding through a conventional funding mechanism, mostly from donors in Europe. And then 5 years ago, I joined the board of an organization called the Urgent Action Fund for Women's Human Rights. It's based in the U.S. that provides rapid response grants for women human rights defenders at risk. And then 2 years ago, we set up the Urgent Action Fund for Women's Human Rights Asia Pacific. So that is an activist fund. So this is maybe before this, the title, this is kind of background for why I'm putting this as the title. I am an activist who have through my work as an activist has come to a situation where I see there's a fundamental structural problem in the way we build our movements, in the sense that we have not really worked out a sustainable and comprehensive strategy to resource our movement in a sustainable way. So it's not just about the role of donor organizations and project funding and so on. This is the nature of my my quest and what I'm sharing with you today. Okay. So I won't repeat what Rosalia has already said, but these are just some milestones in the way that international aid has been changing over time with the international consensus building by states about aid. For example, with the aid effectiveness that began the conversation about using government systems, which meant that all international aid in that framework would be provided through governments in situations where not all governments are accountable, nor are they interested in democracy. So that was already problem. The problem was already emerging there in terms of its negative implications for civil society, autonomous civil society. It also started the discussion on private-public partnerships. And then when the SDGs was agreed upon, that was followed immediately by a new consensus on financing for development, which further developed the initial ideas that came out of the aid effectiveness conversations among states, and basically now is set that, again, aid becomes number 4 or 5, almost at the bottom of a list of sources for financing development, first of which is taxation, and then the role of private sector, and then philanthropy, and only after that is international aid. So there's less and less commitment and interest by the conventional donors in the global north to support aid in the global south. In the meantime, as authoritarianism and right-wing politics rise and civil society, and it became clear that civil society was under threat, then I think there was some further discussions And now I think there is some more interest or at least recognition that a model that is totally dependent on state systems would undermine civil society and democracy. So new efforts or new initiatives are beginning to arise. For example, in Canada, the Prime Minister Trudeau has announced a feminist foreign assistance policy. So he calls it the feminist foreign assistance, and supposedly we still don't know quite exactly what that would look like, but some reports are saying that it might include $150 million for grassroots women's organizations over 5 years. So, you know, although that's very small. I'll tell you when I'm ready to move. So this is just to say that it is a fluctuating scenario, and that we probably, or I and my colleagues, are not depending on things changing, going back to the way things were. So this will be continuously this way as the playing field, I suppose. Okay, next. But I just want to very quickly say that we're talking about a small proportion of the amount of money that is being spent by states. This is a very very powerful infographic created by the UN body that does disarmament, to say that in fact expenditures for military is the biggest expenditure there is, and official development assistance is that circle over there, which is a small proportion compared to the defense budgets. And then this little dot is for disarmament per se. But so this is just to say, you know, we're talking about a small proportion of how much states are actually spending. Also to say here that even as we talk about aid, now the approach is more aid for trade, and this has been particularly rising, this model, particularly after the financial crisis of 2008, which affected many of the donor countries. So, you know, the political economy of aid is such that we are probably now entering a new phase that requires new thinking. Next. So, for movements, but at the end, it's not just about the money for movements. And this is the inside look. Rosalia has already mentioned the bureaucratization element, that the hyper-reporting requirements result in a bureaucratization of social change work, because that's what we are doing. And, you know, the implications for that in terms of doing movement building by making NGOs, civil society, become basically small fish, but still working like a contractor mode. That has huge implications in terms of our capacity to really build and grow movements. So the other, again, it's about the terms of receiving the support, not just the amount of money. And in a complex environment where social change activism, you know, moves forward and then 2 steps back, 1 step forward, 2 steps back, and we're, you know, we face resistance and backlash. When donors have this inherent bias towards success, and once assumes that we are a good recipient of the grant if we are successful and measured in such a way, this actually undermines accountability rather than strengthening it. Because we all know, any of us who are working in social change work, we know that we are mostly failing. where most of our efforts are facing so many obstacles that to say that, you know, we will change the lives of 2,000 or 10,000 or 50,000 people over, you know, a period of, you know, 2 years or 5, we know that that's you know, a claim, and that probably cannot be substantiated really. But in order to receive the resources, the funding, and to continue, you know, we continue to make these claims. And it just feels, you know, it feels like a dance where everybody knows it's not quite true, but, you know, this is the way the game is being played, so, you know, everybody follows it. And lastly, donor support for civil society more often than not contributes to an extractive international knowledge system in which local activists have very little access to the global conversations enabled by the insights of their activism. And this comes with so many wonderful, great reports on what empowerment is, what policy change is, published and created by the donor organizations with their academia partners in the global north, published in English in a language that so many people who are the source of their knowledge have no and will never have access to. All the conceptualizations, the new understandings, the new strategic direction that's being promoted or developed because of a critical analysis and monitoring evaluation methodologies get more and more developed and becomes more and more of an expert, requiring expertise, whereas the people on the ground actually doing the activism has no access to that, cannot replicate it, and cannot benefit from the insights that are created from that, that are produced from that. And this is what we would see as an extractive knowledge system. And so, again, it's not just about the money. It's about the terms in which we are receiving the funding. Continue. Next. So, is a different future possible? The Charities Aid Foundation produced this interesting report in 2017 that says that they believe that there's going to be that giving, middle class giving, is growing, and in fact, according to their estimations, that by 2030, the biggest proportion of middle class giving will be in our region, in Asia Pacific, 57%. Of course, we all know China is a huge number in that 57%, but nevertheless, this is a very interesting reading of what a future trend could be. And as an activist trying to find new modalities to resource movements, this is something that gives some promise for a new kind of egalitarian giving based on shared values. So we are not assuming there's a huge institutions, whether it's families or companies that become rich first, and then after they become ultra rich, they share their wealth to those who want to make changes on the ground. What we are looking at here is the promise that possibly we can grow together with the middle class, as long as we inform and are able to build constituencies within the rising middle class. So next. So what it is challenging us is to really come up with a new way of thinking about resourcing our movements in sustainable ways. When we are talking about building movements, we We want to be in the grassroots. We want to build strong roots. And you know, most of the time when we talk about that, we're talking about constituencies. We're talking about working with people at the grassroots. But now we need to start thinking of this model of a strong tree with strong roots in the context of financing our movement. We cannot just be waiting for rain coming from rich and wealthy foundations and companies and countries. We must find a way to grow from within our own economies. Next. For Indonesia, it's an uphill battle because there's a troubling paradox. The World Giving Index, which just came out like this week, actually says Indonesia is at the top now, #1, the most generous country in the world. And it's primarily related, I believe, with the high number of natural disasters that mobilize people's giving. But so it's top most generous in the country. But the Doing Good Index, which is another index that looks at the policy framework, comparing policy frameworks to support philanthropy, local giving, Indonesia is at the bottom with Myanmar in terms of the lack of a conducive policy environment. So you can see that, you know, people are giving and there is no support from the government in terms of making this more sustainable and more effective. Meanwhile, as Leah has mentioned at the beginning, there's increasing government control over international funding for civil society. So this makes us, you know, we have this big possibility looking at the big picture on middle class giving, and yet we are facing very restrictive and very contradictory realities at national level. Next. Just quickly, in terms of an emerging landscape, and I can speak more about what we're doing in terms of resourcing. There's the traditional funding mechanisms, and Rosalia has mentioned about that, including that, you know, the Asia Foundations and HIFOs of the world are now functioning as contractors for the bilaterals. And then, of course, you still have Ford Foundation that has their own money. But basically, we still have that kind of conventional funding format. But we are also seeing civil society organizations, particularly those who are looking at new ways to resource their movements, trying out new models. We have YAPICA, which is an old civil society organization, now becoming a member of Action Aid International. And Action Aid International, which has a big global project to support domestic fundraising in a few countries, including in Indonesia. So they have received a lot of support, including financial and technical, from Action Aid to develop, to build a strong giving, local giving mechanism. And they're doing that by focusing on the issue of education. So it's a single issue, mostly building schools, in order to, because it used to be a very, very critical advocacy organization. Now it's kind of focused on rebuilding schools in order to get some social acceptance and hopefully local resource for that. They're doing quite well on that. We have kitabisa.com, which is a crowdfunding mechanism in social media. They've gotten quite good response. However, as a social media mechanism, while they're able to get money from the public, they actually actually do not know who's doing interesting work on the ground. So they're seeing that most of the money that comes to them are the same kinds that are conventional practice in the philanthropy world of Indonesia, giving to people who need medical assistance, mostly that. So that's not social change work yet. We work with them as well. And so this is Indonesia for Humanity, which is my organization. We're trying to develop a collaborative mechanism for getting public donations for work on social change. So we're very clear that the kind of grant making that we do in this organization supports social change work, and because of that, there's a lot of public education that we need to do and building constituencies in the middle class. For this, we are also working with a network called Foundations for Peace, which is like-minded organizations, also activist funds working in conflict and post-conflict contexts and we're trying to, together as a network, establish our identity as activist funds to receive recognition internationally that we are a type, a model, a genus, a category of actors that are playing a unique role and should be supported so that we are able to play this role better. So we are part of civil society, but we are not out there doing the advocacy ourselves. We are not implementers. We are enablers of the movements of which we are part. There's also organizations like PSHK, which is policy reform institution that in order to raise funds, they have set up a school where people pay for it, so they're looking for ways to generate income. Other organizations are starting to create cooperatives for the welfare of its staff. So these are all kind of experiments that's happening in Indonesia, and that's what I'm calling here in the category of resourcing movements as opposed to just funding. And lastly, next, what it means is it's not just about banging on the doors of the donors and demanding more money or demanding that they change the way they work. We have to build our transformative agenda so that we have a better strategy to resource our movement sustainably. Thank you.
Okay, we are going to open the floor for comments and questions. One, I will take three first. One, the other questions? Two? Okay, so please start and then I will look for the three. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Leah, and thank you, all of you, for a really interesting presentation. My name is Daniel, I'm the founder of Rapid Asia. Some of you maybe know us. I just have a question. Could you elaborate a little bit more on what do you think is causing this trend? I mean, I think we all know this trend is true, but I think to solve the problem, it's also important to understand what is actually behind it. So could you maybe elaborate a little bit on that? Thank you.
Okay, second, yes.
Hi, I'm a student at Chula and I'm originally from Pakistan. My question is regarding resourcing these sort of activist movements. And so in Pakistan we see a lot of state hostility, not only state hostility, but also hostility from the society in general regarding most of activism, a lot of activism that's happening. Because activism at the end of the day challenges the status quo, and anything that disrupts the status quo is obviously, it's challenging, and governments are always hostile to that. In that sort of a scenario, how do we resource through society or Western or donors or all of that? How do we make sure that this system of protest or struggle or activism does not die out? Basically resourcing and sustaining these sort of organizations or these sort of activist movements then. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Hey, thanks. Thanks for the presentations. It's really, I find myself nodding in agreement with everything that's being said. I'm Greg. I work with Australian Federation of AIDS organizations. We work in many countries, working primarily on HIV and working closely with Midnight. And I think my question is very much in line with the last question. It's in terms of, a transformative agenda for communities, for civil society. How do we really ensure that we can actually achieve anything when the governments are so controlling and the environment, the space is really not there to engage communities effectively, where everybody has this kind of armchair activist kind of attitude. It's like, how can we really instill this sense of activism back in the communities, which feel very much very much knocked down, I think, by society, and it's, we're talking about marginalized populations, particularly LGBT, transgender, drug users, people with HIV, etc. So, these are really critical issues if we want to ensure that we can reach out to the broader civil society to get actual sufficient funds to ensure their sustainability. The sustainability is obviously the key word.
Okay, last one. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Sudhya Pratana from Indonesia. Thank you, Midnight, for the presentation. I just wanted to say that it is better to contract the funding differentiation, just to explain, to avoid the dependence between single donor or government, like combining between private sector, government, and other agencies. But I think we also need to think about the shrinking of resources itself, which can make the market competition in the local grassroots, because the resources is limited, but the number of agencies is still there in the same site, for example. And I observed that it can cut into the non-accountability of data in the country level when it comes to the HIV number, for example.
Okay, we will start from Nana this time, at Midnight, and then I will be the last.
Yeah, I mean, Leah can speak more about this, but just in terms of what is the cause of the trend, I think it has to do with the shift in the global economy, where the source of growth is no longer in the countries of the global north of the past that have become donors since World War II, since post-World War II, and now the global economy is changing. It's now a multipolar world. China is playing a bigger role economically, and so I think behind that is about the global order that is changing fundamentally, and that's why it's not an easy fix. There's no fix to this issue because it's a fundamental, structural, and maybe even paradigmatic shift. In terms of how do you do resourcing, there's no easy way. We just have to jump and do experimentations. Part of it is that, as activists, we've always prided ourselves with doing social analysis on our problems. Whether it's women's rights, it's inequality, climate change, and all that. We now need to apply our critical analysis not just on issues, but also on where the resources are in our society and who among within our society, so we're not even talking about the state yet, we're talking about society, who among the society could become the first supporters of us. So basically, we need to do constituency building. Constituency building among people with resources. This is a political act. This is not about, this is about looking for people who we think, who are in the mainstream, possibly in the mainstream, have resources, but might be, for some reason or another, understand the issues and struggles that we are carrying out as organizations, civil society or movements, and that we need to build their trust with them. They need to understand what we're doing. They need to believe that we are doing something meaningful, and based on that, can we begin to talk about them being part of the resourcing of movements. Therefore, they become not outside of the movement, they are inside of the movement, but among a different social category. So there's no quick fix again on this one. It requires really transforming the way we think about activism, our own activism, and about who our stakeholders are. And of course, advocacy, policy advocacy to change the way the state sees civil society. It means we need to do more, civil society needs to come together so that they're not in competition with each other for the limited resources. We need to make a case that civil society organizations actually contribute to the public good. We need to show some evidence on that. We need, we need to be reporting not only on issues, but on us as a sector, as a category of players within a nation state. So, yeah, maybe just that.
The question around the limited funding in the same number of civil society groups. So yeah, that does happen, and it happens in terms of actually, it's like fighting for the same pot of money, the little pot of money that there is. So and it creates this animosity between other civil society movements or in the same sector, for example. And it's not easy in terms of like it's really if you do it, you get the funding. If you're not, then you don't get the funding. But I guess for civil societies, we haven't had a chance to actually talk about what if we do come together and form a new group that kind of like use this money together in a much better way rather than fighting for it. But the environment doesn't create that kind of space for thinking about togetherness. It's actually about, okay, look, there is this pot of funding. People apply, then you just apply, and then you of course would apply as an organization. There are mechanisms that are asking for civil societies to form consortiums, to ensure that you are working together. But then it really depends in terms of how you agree before you apply, because that consortium can also be the end of your partnership. Because then you then fight to see who becomes the lead, who then gets to profile, who that. It's very difficult, and we don't have the space to think about, okay, like what is it that we try to achieve as a civil society organization? Because the funding affects everybody, right? And to have those kind of spaces to think beyond your personal kind of issue, I think it's very difficult when you've been with that issue for a long time, and you might feel like you're betraying your community because that's what you've been working on, all those issues. But I think organizations that are able to think beyond their own issues will be the ones who can sustain, because they have to think creatively, they have to think about partnerships, collaborations, particularly with those that they've not worked with before. And they have to start investing in that now, because by the time then, because that funding will dry out, definitely, and then that's when society will lose out. I then the discussions around like different partnerships to have a mix of things. And definitely, I think if organizations are able to think about that you have to sustain as organizations, so you have to do projects. But then there is also ways that you can also do the advocacy, do watchdogging, and then try to get other funding to be able to do that in a way that then you have a mix of both funding as well, but then also to also invest in other kind of like looking at other funding base, particularly around your memberships, the stakeholders that you are reaching out to. Are they able to support you as a movement because they really believe in it and they want to fund you to ensure that you can remain visible and vibrant and able to then raise their voice at the national level or regional level. In terms of the funding changes, I think I'm reflecting in terms of as a gay person and trying to kind of like get the gay money to a gay organization. It's really difficult when it's not in that I guess philanthropy thinking about being able to support your movement because they think it's something else. But if it's a party, then they don't mind spending I don't know how much to get into the party and then how much to spend on the drink. But to kind of like have the opportunity for them to think, oh, actually, that money that you could go to clubs, you can also spend on, for your community as well and sustain that community. Maybe because we're reaching out enough to our community and say, look, this is an opportunity for you to do this as well. Because we were, really writing reports, quarterly reports, and we write the reports. And we were kind of do that active outreach and say, look, our community, you can also support us, and these are the ways you can help support us as well.
Yeah, on the environment, I think I discussed quite a number of factors that are conducive to this situation today. But like Nana said, basically there has been a political change at the global level, at the country level, and gradually, I've been worked with Ford Foundation, Rockefeller, the last 20 years. Now, when we started in the 90s, that was a period in which many organizations would support a kind of transformative, even in very close context, like Indonesia. When I was working in Indonesia, Suharto regime clearly was not supportive of civil society, but it was possible as one of the few donors, because at the time, forget the UN, forget all the bilateral to find civil society in Indonesia, they would not touch it. But the few donors that were willing to do it was very easy to find people who had very clear idea about what they want to do, they knew how to do it, and the question was like betting on those people. Yeah? Your skill as a program officer to give money was to identify these people and organizations and bet them and then give the money to build the capacity, to build the organization, start new organization. In the house in HIV/AIDS, right? That where many organizations were started, but the people were there. You didn't need to decide a priori about what is good for this country, like is happening these days. So I think that was more identify the potential organization, identify the potential champion, and that was the skill, that was the art, like I put it. Now then gradually, there has been a mistrust into civil society, which has undermined the whole discourse about efficiency. Efficiency seen as a report, which you can lie very easily. The report is the easiest things to lie to, right? We know all that. But that kind of things, that this is no longer the trust, is the no longer having people on the ground, is suddenly you have to do all this report every 3 months, and even more, the one that have the efficiency is business contractors. Yeah? It's not, no, there are a lot of myths about this, and I think can be deconstructed but that is part of the political choice. Has been a shift towards the business sector in philanthropy, in development aid, often with consultancy firms that have given advice, that have started to come in the boards. like McKinsey, is in many boards of social sector organizations. Suddenly, the social sector was no longer for activists. They would not choose somebody like me with 20 years of experience in funding to be in the board because I am a social. They would choose somebody from the business sector who doesn't know nothing about development aid. Now that has been the shift, which clearly has to do with the political context, which has become more conservative, and at the same time the undermining of civil society fits into more conservative, right? You undermine civil society, you no longer have the voice, that will also contribute to more authoritarianism around. Nobody is saying anything. So it's a circle, it's a vicious circle, and now we are at this point when Naila say, maybe we are starting to see that, well, it's gone too far. We need again to recognize the role of civil society. Now, my advocacy is we cannot recognize only the role without also start to criticize some of the way aid, money is given, not given, and indeed create new way. And I will make two brief comments. One, the Canadian. The Canadian aid, okay, it's very good. The philosophy is good. They are going to give, but what is going to be the mechanism? You have to write a proposal, right? For a big fund, you have to write a proposal, which then is, right? There is a call for proposal. You have to make a proposal. The one that has the capacity to make the proposal for millions of dollars is going to be people who have special staff, not for that. This international organization, they have development officer that will write the proposal. It's not going to be, even if at the end there will be 250 local groups. But in between, the one who can, and this unfortunately, most of the donor organizations no longer have country offices, and they trust in this global fund. Now, that takes away a lot of access. Now, alternative, I fully agree with what is said. We need to build a constituency. This is the way actually SEA Junction has been the philosophy of SEA Junction. We are not going after the rich people, we are going after peer groups. So people like me or you who are not poor, not rich, we have some extra resources. We can give $1,000, $2,000, become funding members, and this is the peer group that support. This is money that has no strings attached in a way. There is no reporting, there is so, meaning, if you care about LGBT rights, well, let's start to not only be vocal, but also put money where our mouth is, I think. There is a big difference between the millionaire and billionaire, which maybe we will never meet in our life, and people which are middle class and can afford, indeed, as has been said, to make a choice. We go to a party, we buy a dress, or we support some. So that is, I think, something that needs to change also in the way, so the constituency means people that have more or less the same shared value and idea. Now, of course, it takes time, it takes a lot of new way, but it's a peer group funding in a sense. It's crowdfunding, but not necessarily via the internet, more on the ground. And there can be other ways of doing things and looking for alternative source. Now, of course, the diversification, what he was talking about, is a very good strategy, right? So you have some funds coming from individuals, some funds coming from small grant. There are still some foundations that are still critical, not many, but there are here and there. There are still other sources, so put it together and try to operate as efficiently as possible with that. And that, since you are based, you are not alone, you are in a movement and you are in a constituency, that should be sustainable. Now, may not be 100 million operation, right? but still is going to be rooted and thus sustainable on the long term. So there are different ways, or otherwise collaborate with people who can write proposals, who can help, etc., etc. I mean, there are, use the skill that we have, some of us at least know how this. But most importantly, we need to start to discuss the practices. I think there is too much taboo about funding. It's too technical. We don't understand. It's too complicated. You talk migration, you talk women's rights, we all think we know about. Actually, that is complicated too. But when it's funding, we think, oh, funding is... No, let's start to look at this funding practice. And there are many different ways of doing things, and this is also the message. I think it's a very nice message. A transformative agenda for resourcing. So that too needs to be democratized, and starting from a critique of what is currently happening. I think, okay, this is the last because we are charisma. Yes, please.
Okay. I like the transformative agenda. Just one point. I think we need to rethink what we mean by sustainability for NGOs. Our observations about the evolution of NGO in Indonesia shows that knowledge organization is more sustainable rather than service delivery and advocacy organization. So they are sustainable because of their ideas. So what makes them sustainable is their ideas, their influence, not organizations. Many NGO cut 30% of their staff salary to make a saving on their organization because they want sustainable after the project closed. And then what happened? They have an internal conflict, right? Whose money? Whose money? We have to have our own land, own building, our own house. And then after 3 of the 5 founders left, then 2 founders, they fought each other. And then my experience supporting very, very senior NGO, they still have very, very basic capacity problem in financial management after 30 years. So capacity building will not end. So we identify like 3 stages of evolution: service delivery, as you mentioned. The second stages is doing advocacy, but they are also not sustainable. The sustainable organizations are knowledge organizations, where the businesses craft the knowledge. So that's I think transformative resourcing, but also what we mean by sustainable. I think we need to really think about. So don't think that sustainable is that we are able to keep within our staff or have a big building, but maybe our ideas.
Last quick reaction.
Okay, well, yes, I think I really agree in terms of being able to then provide services outside our sector using our knowledge. I think that's something that we haven't really tapped into in particular. So I fully agree.
I think the key to sustainability is relevance, that you are continuously reviewing your work, your role, your function to ensure that you are relevant to the challenges of the time.
Yeah, I think this is indeed... actually, organizations don't need to survive, I mean, in my view. You know, I mean, if SEA Junction in 2 years is no longer relevant or whatever reason, yeah, then we close it. Something else will be born. As long as the messages have, I mean, this always happens, right? In a movement, if indeed we are talking about movement, we are talking about a constituency, then the important thing is that the values, the critical thinking is transmitted. Now, if that happens, even if this die and something also come in the place which is more suitable to the time, actually there is not, it's still sustainable, right? It's sustainable because, like you say, it's idea. So I don't think it's only knowledge. Actually, many advocacy idea have become sustainable. If you want to see the positive side, yeah, many NGOs have died, but the idea that they have, in terms of women's rights, in terms of human rights, they have. Yeah, they are being taken by others. Even many of the terminology, many of the ideas have been taken by government, have been taken by other international donors, but unfortunately they don't recognize the role of the HIV/AIDS is a classic example, right? The success of combating HIV/AIDS in this region clearly was because of civil society growth. But then you had cocktail medicine, you had the doctor taking over, and now everybody is forgotten, right? But actually, clearly, the frontliner, the 111s, the prevention, that were, and many other. I mean, I can give many examples. So many of these ideas have become kind of inclusive growth and many other of these things. The problem is that civil society is not recognized, and therefore the value of civil society. So that is also an important part, documenting the contribution of civil society, because that will show that actually beyond many of these ideas that now many take credit for, actually beyond there have been civil society movements which have spread the knowledge. So that is sustainable. So this is the real sustainability, I think. And so we can be optimistic while also starting this new battle about more resources for civil society. Now with these words, on your way out, please give a donation.